When reconciliation comes up in Canada, music is often treated as the good news. It's assumed to unite people, to heal wounds, and to move freely across boundaries that history has divided. But after researching Indigenous music, listening to Indigenous artists, and reading Dylan Robbins' Hungry Listening, I realized something uncomfortable. Music can also repeat colonial harm depending on how we listen. This video is about what reconciliation looks like in music, what has already happened, what is still in progress, and what needs to change, not just in institutions, but in listeners like me. Music has always been central to Indigenous life. Long before reconciliation was a national conversation, Indigenous music carried history, ceremony, language, and law. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, music among First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis people is deeply tied to spirituality, community, the land. Some songs are social, some ceremonial, and some sacred, and not all are meant to be shared publicly. This already complicates the way many settlers approach Indigenous music. Western listening traditions often treat music as universal, accessible, and open to interpretation. But Indigenous artists repeatedly stress that music is relational, not natural. It comes with responsibilities. This is where Dylan Robinson's concept of hungry listening becomes essential. Robinson argues that settlers often listen to Indigenous music in ways shaped by colonial habits, extracting emotion, meaning, or inspiration without respecting context or protocol. Even well-intentioned listening can become another form of taking. So when we ask what reconciliation looks like in music, the first answer isn't about stages or rewards or playlists. It's about how we listen. It's important to say this clearly. Indigenous music was never waiting for reconciliation to begin telling the truth. Artists like Willie Dunn were writing songs about colonial violence, displacement, and injustice decades before Canada acknowledged residential schools. Many of the Indigenous musicians interviewed by the CBC emphasized that the shock many Canadians felt in 2021 after unremarked graves were publicly confirmed was not new information to Indigenous communities. Survivors and families have been carrying that knowledge ever since. Music became one of the ways those truths survived when they were ignored elsewhere. So when reconciliation enters music spaces today, some artists are skeptical. Not because they reject healing, but because reconciliation often centers settler comfort. Melody McIver describes reconciliation as aspirational at best, arguing that Canada is still working through truth and reckoning. Others, like Jonathan Adams, openly reject the term reconciliation and instead speak of Indigenous resurgence, a focus on survival, creation, and flourishing without needing settler approval. That doesn't mean nothing has changed. There has been progress. Indigenous artists now have greater visibility across all genres, from classical to hip-hop to experimental music. Indigenous-led labels festivals and radio stations have created spaces of control and care. Contemporary indigenous music increasingly addresses identity, intergenerational trauma, and resistance, while also celebrating joy and continuity. The Music Impact Study reinforces why this matters. Music is not just cultural expression, it supports mental health, strengthens identity, and builds community. For Indigenous artists, this impact is deeply tied to their healing. But visibility alone is not reconciliation. As Aisanabi points out, supporting Indigenous people is not reconciliation. It's Indigenous people doing the work themselves. Funding exists, but access is uneven. Criteria are often based on Western ideals of professionalism that exclude the very artists who need the support most. This puts Indigenous musicians in a constant double role. It's either be cultural truth tellers or system navigators. It's completely unfair. Some of the most powerful expressions of reconciliation are found directly in the music itself. Gayle Wolf's Child of the Government confronts the 60s scoop and the theft of Indigenous identity. Gator Bauloui's 215 responds directly to the confirmation of unmarked graves. Nick Sherman's Winter Dark reminds listeners that colonial systems affecting Indigenous youth are not historical but ongoing. These songs don't refer to comfort or closure. They demand accountability. They resist being consumed. This resistance is exactly what Robinson argues settlers must learn to respect. Ethical listening means accepting that not everything is meant to be understood, resolved, or enjoyed. Sometimes the most respectful response is discomfort. This is where justice frameworks matter. I chose these articles because they point to the same core issue: control. The MMIWG 61 emphasizes Indigenous leadership and cultural safety in the media, which is directly relevant to how Indigenous music and stories are shared. The articles from UNDRIP affirms Indigenous people's right to their self-determination and self-government, including cultural expression. And the TRC article 85.1 calls on media and arts institutions to represent Indigenous peoples accurately and responsibly. Together, these frameworks reject symbolic reconciliation. They demand structural change. So what does reconciliation in music actually look like? It doesn't look like access without consent. It doesn't look like celebration without accountability. It doesn't look like one day a year. Reconciliation in music looks like ethical listening. It looks like supporting Indigenous-led spaces. It looks like understanding that some songs are not for us, and that this is not exclusion, but sovereignty. The most important thing I learned from this research is that listening is an action too. It can reinforce colonial power, or it can challenge it. Going forward, I will learn to listen differently, and so will you. I will question my expectations as a listener. I will support Indigenous resurgence rather than consuming Indigenous pain. And I will carry these understandings into how I engage with music, media, and culture more broadly. Because reconciliation in music doesn't begin with sound, it begins with how and why we listen. Thank you.